You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that had, has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoy the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you. Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech and Future Tech Health podcast. I have a great guest today, Thomas Hartung. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins. He works in what's called the human toxome, looking at toxicology and other issues. He has many publications, over 450 publications, it looks like, and many years of work in various fields here. So instead of me bungling what he does, I'm going to ask him. So, Thomas, thank you for coming. Tell me about your work.
Yeah, happy to do so. I mean, I made a somewhat unusual career that I left academia for a while. I was a professor for pharmacology and toxicology in Constance, Germany, when I got the offer from the European Commission to join them and had an institute, which is the European Center for the Validation of Alternative Methods. It is their place for promoting things which are replacing possibly animal tests and validating them, so helping the regulators to decide whether they can rely as well on a method which is not employing an animal or is using less animals, making the animals suffer less. This was a very interesting time at the Lago Maggiore in Italy, where we had a lot of impact on also the legislation in Europe, on chemicals, on cosmetics and others. But I could not resist the offer in 2009 to join Johns Hopkins, where I have a chair for evidence-based toxicology, and I'm directing their Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing.
So what is the big alternative to animal testing? Is that organoids derived from human tissue, or what does it look like?
Yeah, this is actually one of the hottest areas at the moment in cell culture work. But you have to see, the idea to replace animal testing is not new. But the technological opportunities have evolved dramatically over the last few years. If you take a classical cell culture, and these methods are not really around very long, cell culture in the 70s and the 80s was really very much you do-it-yourself type of activity, where you had to do each and every reagent yourself, essentially. And this is now a big business. There's companies in this multi-billion-dollar turnover who are supplying the tools for cell culture. And from something which really looks like pan-fried eggs in a pan, that's how cells in the petri dish actually are looking. We have now moved away to something which is really reproducing some of the architecture and the function of organs, and we call them organoids. Very often we even include a perfusion, like blood perfusion, and call them an organ on a chip. So these are really the most recent additions in life sciences to mimic human pathophysiology.
Well, in your pan-fried egg example, it's the cell going from 3D, maybe spherical shape, to almost flat, 2D. So I could see, immediately, that's one good thing about organoids that are 3D versus just cell cultures. And then you have you can enable cell-to-cell communication, and like you said, do perfusion of nutrients. You can do all kinds of things. So what's kind of the state of the art for organoids? What's a typical organoid look like? Does it approximate all the functions, and does it have all the cell types of a given organ, or does it just do one?
I mean, this is a permanently moving field. It is we are making a lot of progress, but we cannot say this is now the standard. When I'm talking about these organoids, there's typically a few labs in the world which really have the best and most advanced technologies, but it's spreading very quickly to others. And we see that articles about describing how to do even better organoids are mushrooming. All of the leading journals are full with excited stories about finally we were able, especially using human stem cells, to produce something which is really showing the functionality of a human tissue. And this is one of the reasons why in vitro at the moment is really booming, because it's really something completely different. A cell which is in a petri dish is having 50% contact to plastic and 50% to cell culture media. There's hardly any contact between these cells because there's only a very, very small rim of each cell which is contacting other cells. And this has enormous impact on communication of cells, for example. The differentiation, they are not showing any functionality if they are flattened out. The density of cells in these conditions is only a tenth of a percent of what the density of cells is in a normal tissue.
What I've learned recently about extracellular vesicles or exosomes. So you're saying you don't see any. I don't know if you can even establish this, but cell-to-cell communication appears to be absent in a 2D matrix versus a 3D organoid. Is that what you're saying?
Not absent, but much more difficult. I mean, if you are in very dense contact to other cells, you have a lot of attachment opportunities, and there's hardly any space between two cells. It's easy. If everything has to be excreted first and dilutes into a large volume of cell culture media, the likelihood that your signal reaches the next cell is very, very low. So cell communication is drastically improved if you have a tissue type of setting. And this is what these organoids are about. And they're typically a small cell mass where really like cut out of a tissue.
How do you construct the organoid? Is it 3D printed layer by layer? Or do you have an existing framework that you drop cells into? Like, what are some of the methods?
There's very different technologies which have to suit different organs. Printing is certainly one of the high-tech solutions and gives you a very standardized tissue possibly. But the disadvantage is it takes time. And the printer is only having a certain resolution. You can add certain number of cells, but you cannot really mass produce many tissues at the same time, for example. There's also other systems which are simply self-organizing. We, for example, ourselves are working on so-called mini-brains. These mini-brains develop from stem cells, and these stem cells are proliferating and differentiating at the same time, and they form more or less spontaneously with our guidance, they form organoids. And they show some architecture and some functionality of an embryonic brain, of a very early form of a brain. And the different cell types are produced by this growing cell culture. And in between are quite a few different types of devices where you seed your cells on different types of plastics, different types of biomaterials like the extracellular matrix, which is typically in between cells. And you can generate very, very different looking type of organ structures. What they have in common is that they are three-dimensional, that they're very often having the different cell types of the tissue, and that they are collaborating and are producing some organ functionality.
Are these organoids always sitting on a substrate, or can you do a free-floating one in a liquid and see how it develops that way?
That's a good point, because it makes a dramatic difference for a cell whether the cell is adhering to some scaffold, so some plastic or metal or whatever you're providing, or whether it is free-floating. In our case, we are using a shaker culture where we don't permit the cells to adhere. And as a consequence, our mini brains are perfectly round balls of cells, and we get them highly standardized by doing so. So the free floating is for us an advantage. However, any type of connection to the outside the outgrowth of axons from the nerve cells is not possible in this setting. They can only communicate with themselves. They have no input, no output if you have them freely floating.
What about conductance through the medium? Can that simulate communication with the nerve cells?
Yeah, the medium is always a critical point in cell culture. What we're typically doing is we're adding cell culture media which are very much mimicking the composition of blood, except for the cells. And then after a day or two, we're replacing them. In the meantime, the cells have extracted all of the nutrients, the oxygen, and they have put in a lot of waste products, but also signal molecules. And then we typically exchange this after a day or two in a very quick and dramatic change. So they're shocked. They're really shocked by changing conditions in this with this change of cell culture media, which is a big reason for why these cells need to stay very adaptable. They cannot really terminally differentiate and be highly specialized because this requires a stable environment. We call this homeostasis. In the body, everything is extremely controlled. The cells don't have a sudden change in temperature, in pH, whatever, because we maintain all of this in the body. So the cell culture media are really critical. And for this reason, some type of perfusion, which is allowing you to standardize at least the media conditions, have a continuous exchange, or you're even recirculating these media, make also a strong impact for creating a more physiological situation for the cells.
There's a lot to replicate. I mean, you need the blood source essentially to be in a flow state. Then you have the termination of the blood and the movement through the interstitial fluid into the cell and then out of the cell, and the electrical signaling and it's amazing all the things that go into it.
Absolutely, and there's a lot to it. I mean, it includes shear. The flow has an effect. It also determines really the size of the organoids you can produce. You know, in our body, every cell is only a few cells away from blood. In cell culture, if you grow these things, you typically have only the fluids, the cell culture media, outside of the organoid, which means that the center of a larger organoid does not get enough oxygen, does not get enough nutrients, and we see very often that these cells are actually rotting in the center, these organoids. We call this necrosis or apoptosis if it's a more suicidal type of cell death, which means that the cells are healthy only on the outside in a large organoid. And this is where perfusion offers a lot of opportunities. But it's also technically very challenging how to get these little channels of fluid into an organoid.
Well, how come it's not possible to have, capillaries grow through the organoid? Is that level of structure just not achievable yet?
There's some groups which are spearheading this. So we have some collaborations where people really try to develop vascular systems, and we want to see how our brain structures interact with these, but that's exactly things happening right now in the laboratory. It's nothing I can talk about in the sense of a success story, but it's certainly a way forward. But it requires to bring people with different expertise together, people who are the specialists for the vascular system, and these cells are requesting completely different conditions than the brain culture. So we need to find cell culture media which are working. We need to find devices where our brains can accept to grow, where they still get all of the nutrients, and at the same time the endothelial cells and other structures of the vasculature are happy. But these combination of organoids or of organoids and additional cell types, like also immune cells, this is exactly the forefront at the moment. There's more and more paper coming out now for 2 organ systems, 4 organ systems, and I think the record so far is 10 organs for 1 month stably working together.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about interconnecting the organoids and seeing the upstream, downstream metabolites and how that affects each organoid in series.
Oh, this is what we are only learning from current experiments. People are talking about a human on a chip. so really a multitude of organs. It will likely never be complete, but you have very dynamic systems where there's crosstalk between the different organs. There's a situation where, let's say, a liver organoid is going to metabolize things and other organs are reacting to this. They're also going to condition their cell culture media in the sense that they are making them different over time. And this is a crosstalk certainly of various organs. And by doing so, I think we will revisit a lot of our understanding of physiology and of the interaction of different tissues.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was thinking about, you know how people will say, alcohol is processed in the liver. So I was thinking that in digestion, food would come in and the liver would talk to the gut, and the gut would tell the liver, all right, send this mixture of enzymes that's tailored to what the contents of the stomach appear to be. So let's say the liver does that, and I may be wrong about this, but let's say the liver does that. Then stuff's digested, it goes into the bloodstream, and then it reaches the liver in a different form. Then the cells of the liver take in that material, they metabolize it, they probably produce their own metabolites, and now it's different yet again, and that metabolized stuff now goes out and exits the liver and maybe goes back into the bloodstream or goes somewhere else and affects other organs now differently now that it's been metabolized by the liver. Is that at all an accurate statement of the different things that happen?
That's absolutely correct. You say it a bit simplistic, but it's everything which happens to our body is handled by a variety of organs. If you stay with the example of alcohol, you have your beer, you have your wine. The first thing is that this has to be taken up by the gut. And this determines, for example, the kinetics. So how fast is this going up? What is the blood alcohol level you would reach? Depends very much on how fast this uptake is. And then the liver is the first organ to really catch a lot of this stuff, and it is converting it, among others, to acetaldehyde. And it is not the alcohol itself, it's the acetaldehyde, which is then problematic for the brain and is intoxicating us and is producing all of these side effects. So it is a matter of how fast is the liver dealing with this, how much of this acetaldehyde is forming, what are the levels now of this substance, and it is an interplay. In order to mimic something which is relevant to humans, you need a barrier in the gut which is taking up alcohol with similar velocity as it would do in a body. You need a reasonably sized organoid for the liver, which is doing the metabolism of the alcohol, and you need then also the possibility to get the acetaldehyde which is forming into the brain. And this is really a lot of fine-tuning until you have a relevant model. You could actually say something about, okay, this amount of alcohol is problematic for, in the end, your brain function. In case of alcohol, we know. In case of alcohol, we know this all from millions of experiments done every day, because we know what alcohol levels are problematic. But you have to imagine we're dealing with a lot of new chemicals, new substances. In the US, for example, about 1,000 chemicals receive pre-marketing notifications, which means people want to sell them, put them into products. And for them, we have not experience with humans. But we hope to have at some point the systems where we can do just the same thing. Enter them in the system, see how much of it is taken up, how much of this can the liver handle, and what is still a possible impact on the brain, in order to understand whether this is a chemical which is impacting on your central nervous system and its function.
But this is a problem, because even if you made like the perfect liver, it was exactly right, it still is not communicating with the other organs, and it's still not, you'd have to look at, again, the metabolites it produces and then run that through other organs, and vice versa, the metabolites from other organs, then run that through the liver to see, to establish, let's say, cardiotoxicity or other stuff. So it just seems difficult, because even if you get the organ right, there's still more to do.
Oh, absolutely. And this is the challenge, but it's also an exciting time, because, over the last decades, we were typically going smaller and smaller. So we were drilling down, we were looking into, from what does the organ do to what is actually the cell which is responsible what is the genes in the cell which are changing, what is the chemical conversion, so we're getting molecular. And in the end, we did know more and more, but we did not really, it was very difficult to go backward and say, what does it actually mean for the body? And now we are in a time where we are constructing larger systems. It's a time where we are no longer satisfied with having a single cell in culture and understanding its role, but we want to understand the cell in the context of other cells. So, for example, take a lung. A lung has more than 40 cell types, and it's not helpful. We cannot understand how the lung works studying a single cell type. And this holds for all of the organs. Now we're in a phase where we produce organoids with all of the cells and a proper architecture. And we're going a step further by saying, how do now two organs work together? What is the interplay between liver and brain? Or possibly then a dozen of organs to understand really what is happening with a substance for which we don't know what it is doing.
So these organoids are being used to test various compounds to see their toxicity. Is that the main use of organoids right now?
Let's say this is one use. It's a use which is very clear and straightforward, you would say. Also, we do have a lot of traditional data because many substances have been tested in the past, and we can very directly ask, are these substances showing the same effects in our models? To be clear, so far there is not a single regular use for any of these organoid cultures for testing the toxicity of substances that the substance can go to the market. But the vision is that this is only very, very few years away from here, because we do such a enormous boost to the relevance of these systems that it could be even better than an animal test, which we're doing so far, because it's a human tissue, and we're not 70-kilogram rats. And there's a strong desire to bring these type of systems into our decision process, also because we don't have to make an animal suffer, and it might be very much faster and cheaper to test in these systems. But it's not stopping there. It is not only about testing toxicity of substances, it is also about modeling diseases. So these models are really enabling technologies. So for example, we have for mini brain not only studies on how can we find toxic substances among the pesticides, the flame retardants, and the other substances in the world, but we also look into how can we model virus infections, how can we model malaria and its effect on the brain. So we published, for example, just on dengue and Zika virus and their effects on brain. We have projects on cancer. So we grafted, so we brought in to our model glioblastoma cells, which is a very aggressive tumor of the brain. We brought these tumor cells into the healthy mini brains, and we can observe how they grow, how they expand, and we can study treatment options. So the real important point is this is opening up at the moment with a new technology to study some very, very important medical questions for the first time within human tissue.
Yeah, I would think in looking at toxicity that you'd have to really do a gut organoid first, if there is such a thing, and then start hooking up other organoids that come after it, I guess, in the cascade, because that's really what emulates what happens to us when we consume any food or medication, right? Unless it's directly injected in the blood.
Yeah, it's but there's different routes of substances to get in. Some are coming through the skin, some are coming because we inhale them. So you need different entry ports, and very often it is not the most difficult thing to study the entry, because this is really a passage through a two-dimensional system. But the important things at the moment is to see at the end, is this substance problematic for the brain at all, for the liver, for the heart? And we only need to worry if there is effect on these organs. And we need to worry much less whether they get into the body at all. But you can also do it the other way around and say a substance which does not make it into your blood circulation is not really problematic. If it's staying in the gut, okay, we worry less. And so wherever we can get some safe ground where we can anchor our risk assessment, we are happy to do so and say this is looking more problematic, this is looking less problematic.
Well, like if I'm studying a medication, for instance, that's injected, I could see, okay, there's a direct path to a given organ. But if I'm looking at a pill that I eat, it has to go through the gut first. Do we even know what happens to various medications after they've been processed by the gut and now just start into the bloodstream? Never mind having been processed by other organs.
Oh yeah, for drugs we actually know this very well, because you don't go into human trials even of the first drug without a pretty good understanding of what happens to these substances. Are they really taken up? Because it kills your substance instantly if it's not taken up and gets in the bloodstream from the pill you're producing. And at this stage, when you do this for the first time in humans, you've typically spent already $200 million for the development of this drug. So the companies are very careful to study in systems that the substance is, we call it bioavailable, which means it reaches the organism. And they're doing a lot of effort into optimizing that the right amount goes into the human. And this is the type of formulation. A pill is not just one substance. A pill includes a lot of things which are helping that you control the uptake of a substance into the organism. We also study then what happens to the drug if it's taken up. So you have a pretty good understanding what does the liver do to the drug, how does it get out of the body, what is the contribution of the kidney, is it going back into the gastrointestinal system and excreted with the feces, or are you exhaling actually the substance? All of this happens, and it is part of the development process for a drug to have to understand these things. And again, organ models are probably delivering better data here than the pan-fried eggs in the pan, which I refer to as how cell culture used to look.
That's good. I guess there's still really a long way to go, though. It's just amazing how complicated everything is. It's really crazy.
It clearly is, but what we see is that at the moment we are entering really in a type of logarithmic growth in these models. It really has been a rare thing that people did study organoids in 10, 15 years ago, but the combination of advanced bioengineering and especially the availability of stem cells, which are ethically not problematic, has been a very important point. You have to understand it is very difficult to get human tissue, with the exception of blood and skin. Who gives you a piece of his liver? If at all, this happens as part of surgery, then these people have a reason for getting a resection of a liver. So they're diseased. They're typically old. Nothing is standardized. You don't get enough material. You cannot plan your experiments. Next week I want a piece of liver. Nobody can plan. Stem cells are the solution to the problem. The first ones were embryonic stem cells, developed only in 1998, but these cells were ethically problematic. Many people did not like the fact that surplus embryos produced for in vitro fertilization, instead of being thrown away, were used in research. But in 2006, Yamanaka came up with a solution to this problem by producing a type of embryonic stem cell, but just from skin cells. So reprogramming normal human donor skin to become an embryonic type of cell with their consent. And then you can go the entire path of making these embryonic cells a liver, kidney, a heart, a brain. And this got the Nobel Prize in 2012, one of the fastest ever, only 6 years after description, because it was such a groundbreaking development that suddenly in research we have access to human relevant tissue. And this is really short on time scale of research. We see at the moment an explosion of work with these stem cells being used for essentially every type of the life sciences, because suddenly we have tissue of high quality.
Are people using, so what kind of stem cells are being used? Like, are they using liver stem cells to create liver organoids? Or are they just using generic stem cells from skin or fat to differentiate into all the organoids they want?
There's a few different approaches, but the leading approach at the moment is to start with so-called induced proprietary stem cells, which is the Yamanaka method. It has been varied by others, but in the end it is about reprogramming. Some people now don't reprogram skin; they reprogram instead blood cells, or they even reprogram now from urine. The few epithelial cells which are in urine, you can make them induce pluripotent stem cells as well. And there seems to be no real difference between these and others. And people are much more willing to give you a little bit of pee instead of a piece of skin. So the accessibility of these cells is really enormous. There has been a sideline of fat tissue. You can also reprogram fat tissue, but it's a bit more limited in the tissues you can generate with these. And we're learning over the last few years more and more how do you produce the best brain, how you can produce the best heart, the best liver. Some of them are not yet optimal. There's some limitations, but the progress is enormous for just a few years of scientific work.
So what do you think the order of the progress is going to be over the next few years? What will happen first in terms of improvements, and then what next and what next?
You know, science is not on a linear trajectory. There's so many scientists at the same time working, and each and everyone is making a contribution. You can also not predict where suddenly certain things accelerate. I see at the moment a big challenge to really have finally high quality liver culture from these stem cells. Because at the moment, the livers I've seen so far are always a bit baby livers. They're not yet the liver of an adult. And this is something which would really impact enormously, because the liver has a very central role for all of what happens in our body. And especially it's a very central role for what happens to a drug. The liver is typically the organ which is taking up the drug, and it is metabolizing it and making it ready for excretion. And because of the central role, I think pharmaceutical industry, but also basic research, we all would very much like to see that the liver models are improving. There's other challenges. For example, the kidney. The kidney has one of the most difficult architectures, and we have difficulties to produce, even with the availability of better cells, to reproduce a functional kidney unit. And there's some progress being done. Other organs are more easy. The heart, the brain are a bit on the forefront, because the heart is in essence a contracting muscle, and you don't need to have the entire functionality to study it. The brain is, fortunately for us, that's what stem cells want to become. Yeah, so if you leave them alone, more or less they're forming some type of brain structures.
Oh, really? They preferentially want to become brain?
Oh. Yes, it's quite funny. Mouse stem cells want to become heart. So you see a pretty spontaneous formation of heart cells. It's a bit. We are also not 70-kilogram mice, obviously.
Yeah, that's very strange. So, what's the best way for people to learn more about what's going on and to get a sense of it? Where can they go?
Well, there's obviously a lot of places which is communicating science, from science journals for lay audiences to more and more events offering information. Our center, the Center for Alternative to Animal Testing here at Hopkins, is aiming to inform about such opportunities, especially with respect to what are the technologies which could possibly replace animal testing. So we are really doing teaching which is geared towards scientists, first of all. So we have made our courses on these topics also available for free via online platforms like Coursera, where now students all over the world can learn from us what we know, that we can accelerate the process, that you don't have to pay $10,000s at Hopkins to take these classes. But there's also communication to wider audiences. So we are trying to bring this to conferences which are also geared towards science journalists, like the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or European Science Open Forum. We're also distributing this via web newsletters. We have a newsletter with about 8,000 subscribers, and we are informing about things which are happening, progress, papers which we published, and all of this is part of an effort to communicate to people interested in science. And last but not least, we're entertaining policy programs. So we're working with 2 people on Capitol Hill. We're working with a person in Brussels, the European Parliament, to tell policymakers about this progress so that they write legislation open for technical advances. Because very often law can hinder progress. Because if it is written into legislation, this is the way to test, safety testing, for example, then it is prescribed and it's very difficult to change. If they write, bring the best possible information for how eye damage happens or lung damage happens, then it is open for scientific progress, because then it is up to the agencies to define this. And this is just an example for openness to certain technologies, which very often comes via the legislation. So we were, for example, extremely thrilled when in 2016, the reauthorization of the Toxic Substance Control Act was prescribing to use wherever possible alternative approaches. Or we were very excited when some 4 weeks ago, the EPA announced that they want to move out of animal testing and want to promote these new approaches. So you see the agencies or the policymakers are really having a strong impact how the field is then going in order to satisfy these demands.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. Excellent. So, Thomas, I appreciate you coming. Any last words for people, or any other resources, or is that plenty?
Visit our website, CAAT, the Center for Alternatives to Animal Testing. There's a very rich documentation. You get a lot of information there. You can subscribe. You should also keep in mind it's not only cell culture. There's also a lot to be said about computational methods, another area of our activity, which we have not touched on, because also these are contributing in a very exciting way at the moment to revamp how we do scientific research and how we minimize animal use.
Very good. Excellent. Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
My pleasure.
You're listening to the Future Tech Health Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Until I reached age 40, I never realized the obvious, that we all have medical issues, or we at least have a family member or close relation that has, or will have them in the future. Medicine and biological systems are the final frontier. Until we've conquered death, figured out how life began, cured cancer, and understood our purpose in the universe, there's a heck of a lot to talk about when it comes to our health. Future Tech Health means I'll be covering futuristic topics that are actually already in clinical trials, or even starting to appear on shelves or by prescription, or available for your own use. We dive deep into stem cells, CRISPR-Cas9, the science of sleep, epigenetics, medical testing, cancer, ketogenic diets, stem cells, aging, regenerative medicine, and more. My goal for you, the listener, is to learn from these podcasts. You may very well learn something that may change the course of your life for the better, steer you towards a new career, or give you insight into addressing a serious medical problem. Remember, however, this podcast and its content is informational in nature only. No medical, tax, legal, financial, or psychological advice is being given. If you enjoyed the podcast, please listen, subscribe, like, and share it with friends. Thank you.